Hi everyone, it's Nomi here. Thank you so much for always watching my videos. Today's topic is about how to approach and alleviate the feeling of tightness in the hip joint. Let's get started right away. The topic of today, the tightness in the hip joint, is something that every therapist has probably experienced at least once. I'm sure you felt it when working with clients. When you're approaching the hip joint area, you might feel a tightness or restriction in the inner part of the joint. Or sometimes, as a therapist, you might feel that it's difficult to manipulate due to movement limitations. Today's video is about considering how we should approach clients with these issues. First, let's look at the cause of this tightness in the hip joint. Simply put, when the hip joint feels tight, it means that the overall distance within the joint is too close. When the distance between the bones is too close, it creates a feeling of collision or potential collision when you try to rotate the joint. This sensation is what we perceive as tightness. Looking at the structure of the pelvis, we see that it has a socket called the acetabulum. The hip joint is formed when the ball-shaped head of the femur fits snugly into this socket. This hip joint ball is positioned slightly outward from the pelvis, so the replacement bone naturally tends to face outward. Looking at the muscle groups around the hip joint, we can see that the muscles that rotate or pull the hip joint outward are very well developed. This is true for the gluteal muscle group, and on the outside there are many large muscles called the lateral hip rotators. On the other hand, the muscles on the inner side are much smaller in volume. The muscles responsible for internal rotation and adduction movements are less developed. So, comparatively speaking, the outer muscles are stronger than the inner muscles, which means the leg tends to be pulled outward more easily. The hip joint structure itself is oriented outward, and the muscle groups on the outside are also larger. The inward rotation movement is actually not very common in our daily lives. So when we try to rotate inward during treatment, it's a movement that's not often used in everyday life. This results in a limited range of motion and a tendency for bones to collide with each other. Now let's consider how we should approach this situation. Basically, since the bones are close together, the simple solution is to create more distance between them. In other words, an approach that's very effective is to move the entire leg while gently pulling it, which is known as the history or understanding of the hip joint. If you're holding the knee, you'll want to pull it in a direction that slightly separates the hip joint and then rotate it inwards. By incorporating this small movement while stretching the hip joint inwards, it creates a much more comfortable sensation for the recipient. This approach method is one that I think is good for therapists to have in their toolkit. It's a technique where you rotate while applying a slight tension. Also, one of the reasons why the hip joint tends to get stuck is that the entire pelvis tends to tilt backwards. The pelvis and femur are connected through the hip joint, so the movement of the pelvis and the movement of the femur are, very closely related. When the pelvis tries to rotate backwards, the hip joint tends to turn outwards. The backward tilt of the pelvis and the outward rotation of the hip joint happen as a set, you see. The same can be said for the opposite movement. When the entire pelvis rotates forward, that is, when the lower back arches slightly, the hip joint and femur tend to rotate inwards. The forward tilt of the pelvis and the inward rotation of the hip joint also happen as a set. I think for most people, their pelvis naturally tends to tilt backward. When the pelvis tilts backward, it becomes easier for the hip joint to rotate outward. In this position, trying to rotate the hip inward feels like you're hitting a barrier. So, if you first control the entire pelvis to tilt forward and then rotate the hip joint inward, you'll be able to create a smooth inward movement. However, be careful not to force your pelvis forward while lying on your back, as this can strain your lower back. Don't overdo it. One of the main reasons the pelvis tends to tilt backward is tight hamstrings. When the muscles at the back of your thighs are tight, they pull on your sit bones, causing your entire pelvis to rotate backward more easily. Tight hamstrings pull on the sit bones, leading the pelvis into a backward tilt. So, by thoroughly massaging the back of your thighs or doing good hamstring stretches, you can loosen up this area and make it easier for your pelvis to release from its backward tilting position. After loosening the hamstrings and creating an environment where the pelvis can easily rotate forward, gently rotating the hip joint while slightly pulling it creates a beautiful movement. This should result in a stretch that feels effortless and natural. Please keep these ideas in mind when working on your hip mobility. Let's summarize one more time. Today I introduced the concept of hip joint tightness. When we say the hip joint is tight, it means you feel a sensation of resistance. This feeling of resistance indicates that there's not enough space in the joint. Simply put, we need to create more space before attempting to move the joint. One technique in treatment is hip joint traction. Pulling the joint outward before moving it is a very effective approach, trying to perform an internal rotation while the pelvis is tilted backward. This can be quite challenging for the skeletal structure and increase the feeling of tightness. If we slightly tilt the pelvis forward and then rotate the hip joint inward, this should allow for a smoother rotation. However, if you try to force the pelvis forward while lying on your back, it will put strain on your lower back. So the basic approach is to first relax the back of the thighs by loosening the hamstrings. This weakens the pull on the sit bones, allowing the pelvis to release from its backward tilt. So, thoroughly relaxing the back of the thighs and then gently pulling the leg to stretch the hip joint is a good approach to keep in mind. More detailed techniques are summarized in the overview section. If you're interested, please check out those videos as well. That's all for today's video. Looking forward to next time. Thank you very much as always.